House Democrats are calling one of their largest and most significant witnesses yet in this whole impeachment probe. I'm talking to you right now about former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton. And they're not mincing any words or wasting any time. They want him, this is new tonight, in as soon as next week. Now, Bolton is the man who reportedly said he didn't want to be part of a, quote, drug deal in the Ukraine plot, and says that he basically was warning people at the White House against doing this. Now, right now, we don't know his response yet because this is a brand new summons. Will he try to avoid or delay or narrow the deposition? He's certainly a big fish. But what I can tell you is investigators have been moving up the chain, and they're getting closer to Donald Trump's inner circle, which is why we're hearing about the summoning of these key aides. There aren't many people left when you go above Bolton. The news comes as the House, of course, is preparing its first ever floor vote on impeachment issues. That's tomorrow. And at this very moment, members are still debating the very resolution that will lay down those official and new rules for potentially impeaching Donald Trump.
Article 1 of the Constitution gives the House the right to investigate the president, and we are taking our responsibilities seriously.
If you think this is fair, this is not fair at all.
In my view, it's not a fair process. It's not an open process.
All of the process that I hear you all arguing about doesn't address the possibility that this president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors.
Congress continuing these investigations today, interviewing two more witnesses in the impeachment probe about Giuliani's shadow foreign policy. You're seeing, again, that familiar sight now, these dramatic arrivals as they go into the depositions. Meanwhile, reverberations continuing from Army Officer Vindman's testimony. Now, he told Congress the mechanisms of the Ukraine plot, and he's also uncorked some very new substantive suspicion of the White House. If you followed this story and you're familiar with some of the alleged cover-ups, this may not surprise you, but it is big and bad news for Trump. Because Mr. Vindman has given a detailed accounting of this other aspect of the alleged cover-up, altering those key notes of the call itself. Vindman telling Congress he actually tried to correct the White House notes when they cut crucial words, which could be damning to Trump's case, including bringing up Biden's more than once. Now, tonight, we are on the cusp of the next phase of this impeachment probe. Democrats getting ready to tackle the first official vote on impeachment, which moves closer to the rules setting out the public hearings where Americans may hear directly from these witnesses themselves and assess the details of this case against Trump, which the president now says that he welcomes after Republicans in the House have been criticizing the process.
I'd rather go into the details of the case rather than process. Process is good, but I think you ought to look at the case. And the case is very simple. It's quick. It's so quick.
Look at the case. Now, the president can change his strategy any time, but note the statement you just heard there today contradicts Donald Trump's White House policy on this entire battle. The policy has been to avoid the, quote, details by demanding that everybody, the diplomats, the Army officers, the whistleblowers, everybody be prevented from testifying. They've failed on that. They've fallen on their face. That's why we keep seeing people report in to testify. And tomorrow's vote goes further, as I'm going to get into later tonight. It forces President Trump into this debate over the details, and if impeached, into a Senate trial about the details. Let's be clear tonight. If President Donald Trump goes on trial, he will be stuck defending the details, which may be why tonight, all of a sudden, he appears to be pretending that that reality forced upon him is some sort of choice he's making. I'm joined now by Natasha Bertrand, who covers national security for Politico, David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Harry.
Natasha, what's your reporting finding about what they're learning on the Hill and how that drives the heat for these floor votes tomorrow?
Yeah, so the testimony that's been given so far by State Department officials, Pentagon officials, White House officials has been remarkably consistent with, of course, the exception of Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU. Now, everyone has pretty much testified the same thing, that White House aid to a White House meeting with the newly elected Ukrainian President Zelensky, as well as U.S. military assistance aid to Ukraine, was contingent upon Ukraine launching these investigations into the Biden's Burisma and 2016 interference. this. So what the Democrats are hoping to do now is keep up this momentum by continuing to call witnesses who can further corroborate all of this. But so far, as I mentioned, the only outlier seems to be Sondland, who says that no one raised alarms internally about the back channel that he, Giuliani, and Kurt Volker, the envoy to Ukraine, were pursuing. But what Democrats seem to be doing now is they are focusing all of their attention on this Ukraine scandal as part of the impeachment inquiry because they know that it's the simplest story that they can tell to the American people. And according to every former prosecutor I've spoken to, this when you're telling the simplest story, then you're beating the opposition. Yeah,
the story's simple, David, and the story has a lot of evidence drawn from people who are Trump loyalists. As Natasha mentions, Mr. Sondland may have some cleaning up to do or may disagree with others. But this Army officer, the diplomats appointed to key positions by Trump, John Bolton, these are Trump people. When you look, David, as an expert on Congress at the vote tomorrow, does that make it significantly more likely that Donald Trump will ultimately be impeached?
I'd be surprised at this point that if he doesn't end up being impeached. I mean, you have enough Democrat support for it. The Democrats are no longer reluctant to move in this direction. The evidence, which is mainly testimony at this point in time, we don't have a lot of documents. I assume, they're trying to get that, and there'll be fights over that. And maybe out of the State Department as opposed to the White House, they can pry some documents out, maybe some personal records. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming. There was not just one quid pro quo. There were 3 quid pro quos. The White House meeting, the $400 million in military assistance, and the Javelin missiles, for which Trump, was willing to talk about, if you will do me a favor, though. And so it's, Trump keeps talking about substance, and now the Republicans keep saying there's nothing there. I mean, their fallback position is going to eventually be, well, yeah, maybe this wasn't so great, but it's not impeachable. That's eventually where they're going to land, the Republicans. And so if that's where they are, the Democrats are certainly going to go ahead and impeach. The real question is the timing. How long is it going to take to have public hearings? Some of the stuff is getting bogged down in court decisions. Bolton has been called, but his deputy, who was called last week, refused to come on Monday, citing a White House order not to appear. And that's being adjudicated now in federal court. How long will it take to do all these things, and how long will it take to get hearings and to have an actual vote in a calendar that's very truncated around the holiday season?
Joyce?
So I think David makes an interesting point there about the timing, but really what works into the Democrats' favor here is if there are articles of impeachment, which are more or less the equivalent of an indictment as we enter into the holiday era, and then we don't take up any sort of serious trial proceedings should they occur in the Senate until after the new year. Prosecutors hate Christmas juries. They're very forgiving. A result in December would likely be tinged by the spirit of the season. But to the point that you took up originally, Ari, there are compelling reasons for Democrats to impeach. And Natasha's right that people love a simple story. And the simple story here is bribery or extortion, a quid pro quo. It is happening in front of our faces. With Trump, so often he does this in plain sight and then says, well, there can't be anything wrong because I did it for everyone to see. But here there's concealment, there's misconduct, there's a bribe, and Democrats seem to have finally found their storyline that's simple but compelling.
Well, and to that point, David, people who work in the administration who aren't directly implicated in this also, perhaps like some Republican senators, don't really want to be on record defending everything that has been basically admitted. Take a look at Trump's nominee to be the ambassador to Russia.
Yeah.
Do you think it's ever appropriate for the president to use his office to solicit investigations into a domestic political opponent?
Soliciting investigations into a domestic political opponent, I don't think that would be in accord with our values.
David?
Yeah, you see a lot of these career public servants. They call them deep staters, never Trumpers, whatever. I mean, Trump's, strategy here is to smear anyone who speaks to this. But we see these career dedicated public servants who've been told in some instances not to testify, still going up there and testifying. Because why? Because they saw what went on, or they saw part of what went on. There's a shadow foreign policy run by a political operative of the president to get political dirt to benefit the president. career diplomats know that is wrong. Whether it's illegal or not, they know it's wrong, and they don't want to fall on a sword for something that is so beyond the norm and then might actually even be illegal. They don't even want to hide behind the White House order not to testify. They want to testify, and they saw what happened to the ambassador Yovanovitch and how she was smeared, and I think they feel that she's been wronged, and they want that to be corrected on the record. So this is, bring this back to Joyce, here you have a case where you have a lot of not willing witnesses, but I think eager witnesses who want the record to be known.
And Natasha, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that another thing about that is that a lot of these witnesses have long careers ahead of them, and they don't want to be forever tainted by their stints in the Trump administration. People like George Kent, who was just starting the first year of a 9-year kind of tenure at the State Department, who was dealing with Ukraine issues. I mean, he testified in part, I'm told, because he wanted to show to, the future people that he was going to work with that he was an honest broker in all of this. And we're just learning that Tim Morrison, who, of course, replaced Fiona Hill on the National Security Council, is also resigning, and we confirmed that with the administration, and we're told that he wants to pursue opportunities in the private sector. Timing, of course, is very notable because he's due to testify before the congressional committees about Ukraine, but it's important to note that these people, these career officials, they don't want to have the baggage of the Trump White House linger with them throughout the rest of their careers.
Yeah, and so take that then to the news tonight, Natasha. The Democrats are summoning John Bolton, who, if you looked at this a year ago, let alone 6 or 8 years ago, no one would expect that John Bolton would be someone that the resistance and liberal Democrats are thrilled about. And yet it's because he's not there as an ideologue. He's not there because of his views of the UN or foreign policy. He's there as someone who is expected and, of course, legally obligated to tell the truth about whether this plot was going down.
Yeah, and John Bolton, we're told, is actually very eager to testify. And one of the main things, of course, that's holding him back right now is, of course, his lawyer is the same lawyer for Charlie Kupperman, who was his deputy at the National Security Council. And Kupperman, of course, has recently launched a lawsuit to determine, to force a court essentially to decide who he should listen to, Congress or the White House, when determining whether or not he's going to testify. But Bolton, left the White House on very bad terms. He was very much opposed to this Ukraine foreign policy shadow campaign being run. And of course, he had his policy differences with Trump in different areas, and he's never been shy about coming out and correcting the record on these things. So it remains to be seen how he's going to approach this legally, because we're told he still wants that shield in order to show the GOP establishment that he has been fighting back against, this impeachment inquiry. But at the same time, he really kind of wants to get the president back.
David?
Well, and remember that despite all the legal arguments and whoever his attorney is, John Bolton, as a citizen, as others have done so in the past week or two, can decide on his own to come forward and speak the truth. It just gets to the issue of, to who's your master? Is it Donald Trump or is it the Constitution? This is not about executive privilege. This is not about I can't portray my oath of keeping, secret advice to the president. This is about whether you saw something that Fiona Hill, who worked at the White House, says that you called a drug deal.
Right.
Drug deals are illegal. Right. They're illegal.
Right.
If you see something criminal.
To your point, David, I mean, Mr. Vindland reportedly gave his truthful accounting. He said why he was so concerned. And when asked certain questions, for example, about what he reported directly to the National Security Council and White House counsel lawyers, he reportedly said, well, that's privilege. I'm not going to get into that. You can fight that out. But even if you recognize a certain privilege, could be executive, could be lawyers, could be medical, you can always say in the deposition, I'm not getting into that yet, and still try to otherwise honestly comply.
Exactly.
Joyce?
That's exactly right. And with these former employees, the White House can't force. We've seen in recent days, even with current employees, if they intend to testify, they can go ahead and comply with a lawful subpoena. So for someone like Bolton, it's far less a question of needing legal protection. Yes, he has the same lawyer as his former deputy. Yes, it's conceivable that he could ask a court to decide whether he has to testify or not. But if he wants to go, he can go.
Right. Joyce, I want you to stay with me because we're going to turn to an official on the Hill, and I'd like your views as a prosecutor. I want to thank Natasha Bertrand, and I want to put David Corn on the spot. Did you know about this Christmas jury thing?
I always call it a Hanukkah jury, so same principle.
Joyce, I set him up for that. I thought he might go there. The thing about
I'm
a
glad
Hanukkah
you did.
jury is obviously they always decide
lasts
the
longer.
verdict within 8 days. All right.
Yes.
I'm sorry. It's my fault. Natasha and David, thanks to both of you. Joyce, stay with me. And now I turn to Florida Congresswoman Val Demings, who serves on both the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, right in the center of this Venn diagram, and someone with a lot of prosecutorial investigative experience. Thanks for coming on the beat tonight.
Thank you, Ira. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you. And as mentioned, Joyce is here as well. Walk us through what you think you're learning. Why are you summoning John Bolton now? Does that mean the Intelligence Committee is nearing the end of the key witnesses in the deposition phase?
Well, let me just say this. In a short period of time, I think it's been slightly over a month now, a lot has happened.
Yeah.
What we do know, if we start with the whistleblower's report, but then quickly turn to the readout that was released by the White House, and we look at the overwhelming, clear and convincing corroborative testimony from our witnesses that have come before us, the evidence is pretty clear that the president abused his power, that the president attempted to coerce a foreign power to interfere in our election, that the president really betrayed his oath of office and the American people, that the president also has obstructed justice and continues to try to obstruct justice by trying to get people to not appear, and then is also involved in a cover-up. The question that still remains as we continue to do our work is really, what do we want to do about it? As you well know, tomorrow we will be voting on a resolution that will further advance the ball down the field as we prepare to move into a public arena.
Yeah, let's get into the resolution. It looks like a set of rules and a blueprint for the potential impeachment of President Trump. Do you view tomorrow's vote, and if it is a majority of Democrats, a majority of the Congress, as showing that the Speaker has amassed a united caucus to ultimately impeach President Trump?
What I can say is that I am delighted to see this vote happening tomorrow because I really think it lays out a very clear process for moving forward, sets the ground rules very clearly. As you know, many of them mimic what was done in 1998, when the Republicans actually helped to write the procedures that we will use tomorrow. As I've said, the evidence against the president, no matter how hard the Republicans struggle to defend him, whether you're looking at the process or attacking individuals, it's pretty clear.
Let me push you a little. What I'm trying to get at for viewers and people around the country is understanding, if they see this resolution pass tomorrow, does that mean we are closer to impeaching the president, or in your view, not necessarily?
No, I think we are much closer because the second phase of this process is to move into public hearings, give the President of the United States an opportunity to respond, which we would certainly love to hear from him. And then we will move to giving the reports from all of the committees with jurisdiction over to the Judiciary Committee. I also sit on that committee, and we will be responsible for reviewing it and writing articles of impeachment.
Well, that's exactly the next thing I want to ask you about. So we're syncing up on the same process. As you just said, those rules take the facts as found by the Intelligence Committee, and then they go to the Judiciary Committee for the potential articles. Our fellow panelist here, Prosecutor Vance, also has testified, we should note, before that committee. My question to you and then Joyce is, do you see the best case for a narrow articles of impeachment around just Ukraine, or do you think the Judiciary Committee should consider other potential offenses?
Well, I certainly think that when you look at the Inspector General's report, we focus on Ukraine because the Inspector General concluded that this particular complaint was, number one, the whistleblower was credible, but that it was of an urgent nature. Because it involved our national security, we all now know that it was of an urgent nature. So you see how far we've been able to advance the ball down the field by focusing on this issue.
Yep.
I don't think there are any intentions, though, Ari, to totally ignore other instances of obstruction of justice, other witnesses that have come before the committee.
Potentially more than one article of impeachment, in your view?
I certainly believe that the Judiciary Committee will be complete and thorough in the work that we will do.
Interesting. And briefly before I go, Joyce, your view.
I think it's hard to argue with success, and the committees that Congresswoman Deming sits on have been very successful at moving this narrative forward. It's simple, it's compelling, although things may have happened in connection with the Mueller report that are equally abusive, equally sort of actions that would warrant impeachment. They may be more difficult for people to understand. And because impeachment is essentially a political process, simplicity and ease of understanding matters.
Very interesting to get such expertise. And in the case of Congresswoman Deming, someone with a vote on the biggest issue facing the nation in the White House right now. That's something that separates you from a lot of other people with expertise we speak to. So Joyce and Congressman Deming, thanks to both of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.